To Stokes, who's onside. 1-0.
Here's Sims. It's a good serve this from Southampton. They could finish the job here. It's Shane Long, and he has done it.
Just a minute to play. That's stoppage time. Here's Letizia. Oh, better to say farewell than one of the finest players ever to wear the red and white.
Hello and welcome to the Saints FC podcast. It is episode 102 and once again I'm joined by Tom Parker. Tom, how the devil are you? Are you well?
Yeah, I'm really good, John. How are you doing tonight?
I'm right. It's quite surprisingly, I mean, we had a terrible night's sleep last night. We have a youngish baby and he wasn't playing ball last night. Teething is obviously the generic parental response to that, but bizarrely today I felt okay. So I'm not sure what's going to happen if maybe I'm just going to slump in the middle of this podcast, but I'm running on some sort of energy which I didn't realise I had. Tom, we're also joined by a third wheel this evening, and a guest that I'm quite excited to introduce you to. We have Alex Stewart from Tifo. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Alex, I'm particularly excited about having you on the podcast. There's a number of reasons. I've been really enjoying your Tifo videos that you put out and the podcast. You're also a Southampton fan, which is quite rare for like the football hipsterdom that we've tried to operate in. And also, you asked me to be on the podcast, which I think is a first from, we'll call you a football journalist or a football content creator or something like that. So, I've had Mick Channon asked to be on the podcast, but you're our first kind of one from the football media world. So lots of firsts there. And I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. For our listeners that perhaps aren't aware of Tifo, do you want to tell us what it is?
So first of all, thanks for having me, and I'm sorry that I'm not Mick Channon. Tifo is a video channel on YouTube. We also produce podcasts, as you said, and we make illustrated videos largely, although we are moving more into, I guess, what we call live action videos, which are largely me or Joe or Seb speaking to camera about stuff. And we try and explain football. So it's... the approach is very much that football fans are smart, considered people who want to learn more about the game and want to understand the hinterland, whether that's social or cultural or economic, tactical as well. And we try and explain that.
So you're kind of the football connoisseur's man of information and intrigue.
I mean, I'm the resident tactics nerd. And stat stuff as well. So I suppose I do most of the tactical content. I do a series that we do called Sensible Transfers, where we look at recruitment for clubs based on data and tactics rather than just kind of guessing or what sounds exciting. But it's a broad range of videos. There's something for everyone, I'd like to think. I mean, check it out. Sensible
Transfers almost sounds like the absolute antithesis of Harry Redknapp. It's almost like you were so repulsed by him as Southampton manager that you've gone in an exact opposite direction there.
That's very much the vibe, yes.
Yeah.
Who would be an example of an unsensible Southampton transfer? Just out of
there's quite a few to choose from.
There are some, shall we say. Korea would be one example, maybe. Yes. Florian Gardos would be another. I don't know. When we do sensible transfers.
Osvaldo, maybe? That was enough.
I quite liked Osvaldo, actually, when he came. He just didn't really do very much. What we try and do is look mostly at how a player would fit into a side. So Southampton, for example, would be quite an exciting challenge. Is really quite distinct. And one of the easy ways would be to look at teams like Red Bull, Leipzig, or Salzburg that play a very similar style. But we gear our suggestions towards the tactics that the team employ, the areas that they're weakest, and then try and find maybe a suggestion that's not immediately in the forefront of everybody's mind, certainly not people that are necessarily being linked with the club, that kind of stuff.
So who would you say, have you been starting to sort of play around with this yet, Alex, for the January transfer window in Southampton?
So we're not doing it for Southampton, although Dan Sheldon at The Athletic, who now own Tifo Football, will be doing a similar kind of piece. And I would encourage people to check Dan's work out because it's really first rate. So there'll be a written piece, but for the videos, to be honest, we tend to keep it for the bigger clubs. No offence to Southampton fans as one. So we'll be looking at people like Manchester United, Real Madrid, Barcelona, probably Spurs, Arsenal, that kind of stuff. And I'll start my research for that next week.
Okay. Interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, I noticed on your YouTube channel that you have a rather impressive 878,000 subscribers. I was rather impressed with that. Being the purveyor of a Saints podcast, I can tell you that we don't have 878,000 subscribers. Just a few short of that. So, that generalist approach certainly makes things more popular. But, to be honest, my interest in other football teams is just nowhere near that of Southampton. I couldn't pull it off. So, power to your elbow for being able to do that. So, I mean, in terms of listeners, my recommendations is that you look out for the Tactics Explained. There was a recent video that you guys did on Ralph Hasenhüttl's tactics at Southampton. I think we tweeted that out a few weeks ago already. So do have a look at that. And then also, as well as the lovely kind of almost old school Championship Manager images, you've got some really great cartoons and sort of lift music is how I would describe it. But they make really pleasing videos. Like it's almost like an information video. And I mean, I've been really impressed because like the Saints FC podcast is very much a sort of homemade thing. My wife's a professional podcaster and I just nick her equipment and then do Southampton stuff with it. But your stuff looks really slick. And I was expecting, when I found you on LinkedIn today, Alex, I was doing some snooping around on the internet and I was expecting to see, media training and, perhaps like graphic design and animation and stuff like that. But you're an ex-copper. That wasn't something I was expecting to see on the LinkedIn profile. So how did you end up in something so slick as Tifo?
It's a slightly curious one, isn't it? So before I was a copper, I was a PhD student, and I'd always enjoyed research and writing. I ended up not finishing my PhD and joining the police because I guess I was looking for something a bit more exciting, a bit more communal, something where I felt like I was doing something useful, And then after 6 years of that, and just getting increasingly frustrated with the Met as an organisation, and I guess finding like I couldn't do the job the way I wanted to. I'd already been blogging about football, so I set up a blog kind of within about a year of the Blizzard starting up, and I'd begun to get interested in tactics and stuff. I mean, I'd always had an interest in football, but I missed writing about stuff, and football seemed like something I could get my teeth into without any pressure, I suppose. So when I left the police, I thought, well, I'm going to try and be a freelance football writer. And I'd met Joe Devine, who's our executive producer, through a podcast that he used to do. And as well as doing other bits and pieces, I ended up writing for what used to be Tifo, when it was called UMaxet, writing pieces for the website. Then when Joe started making videos, it seemed like a natural fit to do tactics videos because obviously you can display tactical information in a visual form that makes it that much easier to understand. So it just kind of went from there, really. Because I knew Joe from before, I ended up moving into kind of more of a content strategy role alongside him and becoming one of the three kind of partners in the company along with Neil, who set us up. And yeah, just kind of, tried to make it work as a business, thought a lot about football tactics, and then back in September of last year, The Athletic started to work with us initially in terms of sponsorship, and then ended up buying us in April of this year.
Oh, nice. So now you're kind of like sat on loads of cash, no doubt, for selling Tifo. So, I mean, you're probably our second millionaire in a number of weeks, having had Mick Channon on a couple of weeks ago. So
I can categorically state that is not true.
Right. Anyway, so let's move on. So you're a Saints fan. We understand that's because you're from the area. So you're raised in Winchester. Is there any player that really caught your eye when you were growing up that really sealed the deal? I mean, perhaps apart from the really obvious one.
Apart from the really obvious one. So I started going regularly to Saints games in about 2002-03. So prior to that point, school and so on. And I don't come from a football supporting family. My dad's massively into F1, as is my sister. My mum and my brothers are equestrian. So I'm kind of the only person in my family who likes football. So I didn't do the whole kind of, going with dad route that a lot of people do. So I started going when I was at university. I'd come down from university to watch games. And I suppose it was that kind of lovely era, certainly maybe after a year or two, where you had people like Michael Svensson, Klaus Lunderquam, Chris Marsden, who I loved, Matt Oakley, Francis Benali, Jason Dodd. It was that kind of era. So I have a lot of positive associations with those guys. Antti Niemi as well as a goalkeeper, which is the position I used to play, although not very well. And then I guess when, I lived in London for 10 years and it became increasingly hard to go to games. But, I always kind of continued to follow the team and obviously the ups and downs of that period. But it's nice, working in football journalism or content creation, or I wouldn't ever describe myself as a journalist, actually, because I don't really find anything out. But Southampton is kind of my release from the rest of it, because I spend a lot of time looking at teams from a quite forensic perspective and dissecting tactics and so on. And that's, I find it interesting because I like patterns and I like explaining stuff. But I've kind of almost got closer to Southampton because I needed a bit of my football experience to not be that. So, I suppose really from the Pochettino era onwards, I've kind of come back into it, which is, makes me sound like I decked out when we got relegated, which is not true. It's just kind of how it's fallen with work and so on.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you're saying is that Alan Pardew and George Burley weren't tactically enthralling enough for you to deep dive into what they were doing.
I remember watching Paul Sturrock manage us. There's nothing tactical going on there.
No. All right, well, Alex, we're absolutely delighted to have you on the podcast, and no doubt we're going to touch on a few of your sort of expert areas as we move through the episode. Obviously, the main thing I think our listeners are here to do is listen to us kind of pick over the bones of Saints versus Brighton, which we saw last night and Monday night. The first time Saints had won on a Monday night since Gordon Strachan was the manager. So going back a fair few years then, although obviously Monday Night Football isn't that frequent. I think that was 14 games without a win on a Monday night. So that was good that we've got there. It was quite an ugly win, and I wasn't totally enthralled with Saints' performance, but they got the job done quite effectively in the end. And although there's a sort of a few kind of talking points where you might suggest that we didn't really do anything particularly special. But as the game started off, I thought Brighton were best in the early parts of the first half, and they had the first chance with Welbeck getting through, and that was kind of a little bit worrying. And then we had the run up to the penalty that we gave away, and I suppose the sort of first question is, what was James Ward-Prowse doing with his arm up in the air? I mean, I thought, was he appealing for a handball from Welbeck, and then it bounced and kind of twizzled around his hand, and he ended up giving away the handball himself. I mean, Tom or Alex, I don't know if either of you are able to explain this any better than I am.
Alex, do you want to have a go?
I mean that. No. In short, it did look. I mean, the hand was so elevated that it did look like an appeal, but it's very. I mean, it didn't look like a sort of attempting to balance kind of hand. It was like he was raising it in class, wasn't it? It was a bit odd. But what was going through his mind, I don't wish to speculate.
I mean, was he trying? Was there a handball by Welbeck? I didn't see it.
Well, I mean, the ball kind of like hit his shoulder, didn't it? I mean, but also it seemed that the hand was up there before really the ball hit his hand. So, I mean, I don't know what he was appealing, but it's maybe an interesting lesson for in this era of the handball rule and VAR and all of that perhaps you shouldn't appeal for anything in the box until after the ball has gone way past you, because he ended up looking very, very silly. Pascal Gross, did the business with the penalty. He tried to sort of trick McCarthy into diving early. That didn't happen. Then McCarthy dived the wrong way anyway. But for a very minor split second, I thought he might save that, but then jumped the wrong way. I felt like it was probably a deserved lead from Brighton. I think without being particularly exceptional or incisive, they were definitely better than Saints throughout the whole first half. And I was trying to work out what was going wrong with Saints, and I thought Gineppo wasn't having a particularly great game, and I didn't think Armstrong was really getting involved either. But actually, I think probably all over the pitch there were issues. Alex, what was kind of going wrong here that has been going right in the previous games this season?
I think a large part of it was the way that Brighton sought to control the midfield area early on. Basuma put in a lot of pressures and really hurried Saints along. And Southampton are pretty good at playing the ball under pressure, but he was a kind of constant thorn in the side. The wing backs were able to tuck in and help out a little bit, and obviously, if you're playing a quite an elegant ball winning centre back in your midfield double pivot as well, that adds to it. So I think it was Southampton struggled to get fluency under that degree of pressing, and I think the 4-2-2-2 shape is probably most exposed by a back three where you can get decent midfield superiority, and it just made it difficult to play through. And I agree in terms of the ebb and flow of the game. Certainly, Brighton started better, and that seemed like a very deserved lead because they were starting to establish real dominance in the centre of the pitch.
Yeah, I didn't think it was a case of Saints playing really badly. I thought Brighton just played really well. I thought they pressed Saints, didn't they, high up the pitch, and I think our centre backs didn't really get the time on the ball they would like in the first half. And I thought Basuma was excellent. He looked like the sort of player you imagine could actually do a job for Saints in terms of both strong,
exactly,
but also really tidy on the ball. And I thought Romeo and Ward-Prowse probably had one of their more anonymous first halves. You've seen them, I thought Brighton actually played really, really well, and you're kind of quite glad that between Connolly and Welbeck, they're probably not the most efficient strikers in the Premier League. And also without Lallana, who I think probably would have given them just that extra little bit of composure and extra little bit of class to unpick Saints. But to be fair to Brighton, I thought they played really well first sort of 44 minutes of that first half.
Yeah, I mean that's the benefit of a 3-4-1-2 is that you can have your strikers going up against the two centre backs or running through onto the goalkeeper, which Welbeck particularly did quite a lot. That attacking midfielder can then push up as well. Plus, if you've got, particularly on the right-hand side with Tariq Lamptey, who is so fast, he can really pin back the left back, and all of a sudden it makes it really easy with that particular formation to start to establish dominance in what would be their attacking third, our defensive third. And you've still got 3-on-2 at the back for Brighton. So there's a degree of solidity there. So I think they just tried to sort of strangle Southampton in that first half, and like you say, we found it very difficult to play through that because of those numerical mismatches.
I mean, it was very effective from Graham Potter, and I think Graham Potter's a very good manager. I sort of had half an eye on him before we signed Ralph Hasenhüttl as manager, thinking that he might, ex-Southampton player, he was doing some interesting stuff in Sweden at the time, and I thought the play might work quite well for Southampton. And it is interesting with the Brighton side, which I don't think is necessarily littered with superstar football players with extreme talents, but he's got them playing pretty effectively and doing the job kind of pretty well. I can't say that I've watched an awful lot of Brighton. I've basically watched their games against Saints and nothing else. So, but one of the things I have noticed over recent weeks, certainly Man United did it, is they kind of set up to frustrate the way that Southampton play. And with Wolves, we saw that as well, with them changing their backline and changing their tactics completely to sort of mirror what Saints were doing and stop that. Were Brighton doing that as well, or is this Graham Potter's normal mode?
I mean, Brighton are relatively aggressive in the press. I would say this is probably, I haven't checked the numbers, but I would suspect that this was a bit more aggressive than usual. I mean, I suppose what you're looking for against Southampton is you don't want the game to become really fractured and chaotic, because that's the situation in which we thrive, when we can either make those surging penetrative runs down the flanks or get that really quick, snappy vertical passing going up through the centre. And the further up the pitch you cut that off, then the easier it is. And if you've got three at the back, even when Theo Walcott's quick and Che Adams isn't slow either, but he's not quite Walcott's pace, you still have that blanket of security. So I think what we saw with Brighton was a slightly different attempt rather than putting out the block, because Southampton will recycle possession quite a lot and take it really quite deep if the initial thrust doesn't work. And I think Wolves particularly tried to get that block and make themselves difficult to play through and get Southampton just going back and round, whereas Brighton were much more assertive in the way that they tried to cut the play off.
I think as well, you mentioned Tariq Lamptey as well, but he's a real player, isn't he? He is just so fast and so direct. And the commentary I was watching last night described him as a train. Once he gets going, you just got to get out of his way because he's going to keep going. And I thought they brought him into the game really well. And you mentioned Djenepo, didn't have a good game, but I think Djenepo is always going to struggle, isn't he, against a player like a Traore or a Lamptey, who is just an out-and-out attacker. I just thought it was really interesting, obviously, how they just... it was almost like Lamptey he's not a right-back and he's not a winger. He just kind of does whatever the hell he likes on the right side of the pitch, and Brighton just get on with it.
Well, Lamptey's played everywhere along that right-hand side of the pitch. I mean, Graham Potter, particularly last season, experimented a lot with formations, and Lamptey appeared as an orthodox right back, as a wing back, right midfielder, and even as a really quite advanced right winger. And I think the thing I like about him is that because he's so fast, he's obviously able to pin the opposition wide players back, and we didn't see Bertrand getting forward as much. Certainly Djenepo, I think, had a pretty torrid time. But he also has the pace to make intelligent recovery runs, so that if a player gets past him, or even if a player is cutting across from the other side of the pitch, Lamptey will be back in his penalty area before you have noticed that he's even set off. He's an extraordinary athlete, but he also has the intelligence to get himself in the right place. He's one of the finds of the season so far, really, isn't. I mean, he kind of came through a bit last season, but he certainly wasn't making waves in the same way that he has done so far.
Right. Well, I'm going to move on from Tariq Lamptey now because this ain't the Brighton podcast. So we're going to have to try and find something positive to talk about with Saints. I suppose kind of one of the advantages of Brighton is that for Saints' perspective is they weren't creating loads of sort of clear-cut chances from open play. It took them a penalty to get a goal. And I suppose it's unsurprising considering the first half that we had that it took a set play for us to get our goal. Finally, we sort of get a good set-piece opportunity. James Ward-Prowse once again with a fantastic corner, and who wants to wax lyrical about Yannick Vestergaard's header here, because it was an absolute thing of beauty.
He's great, isn't he? I mean, you've got an advantage at 6'5", but I sometimes think that can almost count against a player when they're attacking a ball in that way, because there's almost an assumption that you're going to win it. And so, you just sort of rise up and hope for the best. But the way that he guided it, and he's shown this with, I think it's 3 headers now he scored this season. He has an ability not simply to generate the height and the power, but also to have really, really good placement. I think Vestergaard, we'll probably talk about this in the second half, but the way he played generally, I think was kind of part of the key to coming back properly into the game. But the header was just sumptuous.
It was absolutely sumptuous, and you're right, Alex. I have a "How good is Yannick Vestergaard" section prepped for once we get through the main talking points in the game. So we'll save that for that. Although I'm sure we'll be speaking about him again. That takes us into half-time, 1-1. I think we're all pretty relieved to be 1-1 at half-time. I certainly wasn't expecting it. And then at half-time, we saw the sight that makes all Saints fans swoon, and it was Danny Ings on the side of the pitch getting ready to come back on after a pretty short spell on the sidelines considering the injury. And, just shows how determined he is to come back. Hopefully he's not doing it too soon. But I doubt he would risk himself. I think he would be fairly confident with that. And I thought the impact of having Danny Ings on the pitch was immediate. We looked better in the second half. I mean, Brighton looked pretty good as well in places, but I thought we were pressing with more purpose. I think Danny Ings made an important couple of defensive contributions as well during the second half. And it made me feel happy to see Danny Ings back in the side. I mean, Tom, you tell me, how happy were you to see Danny Ings there?
Well, it's not just him, isn't it? He lifts everyone around him. Yeah, he clearly, and also if you imagine if you're Brighton and you're there and you're doing all right and you're thinking, well, Shea Adams is good, but he misfires a lot. Walcott's not what he was, and all of a sudden, that's. It's a bit like what Man United did to us, isn't it? Where they brought on Cavani. And the ability to be able to bring on a player of the quality of Danny Ings just gives everyone a lift. And not only is he a better, probably forward than Walcott, but Walcott's also a better left winger than Gineppo. So all of a sudden, Saints are 2 players better, almost, than they were. And I think his link-up play, the way he leads the press from the front, and just the general kind of I think he just causes kind of chaos, doesn't he? Because obviously he's now developed from a player who kind of hadn't scored. I think before Burnley last year at St Mary's, he hadn't scored from outside the penalty area once in the Premier League, apparently. And now outside the penalty area is kind of his thing.
Even winning goal of the month from Match of the Day, wasn't he? With that outside of the box strike against Aston Villa. Alex, I'm willing to let you have a go at talking about how much you love Danny Ings at this point as well. Let's keep this section of the podcast going.
You can't not love Danny Ings. I mean, I think I agree. I think it's a very astute point, Tom, in terms of Walcott. Also, I mean, Walcott I think has done really well stepping in that role and has shown what a smart and hard-working footballer he is to come into a complex system and pick it up really well, and that speaks volumes for his professionalism as much as anything else. But Danny Ings is the guy who's getting a goal or an assist per game, and that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to replicate. I think actually the point you made about when Manchester United brought Cavani on as well, that there is an analogy there, because the other thing that Cavani did so well in that game was lead Manchester United's press. And Ings presses in a different way to Che Adams. So Che Adams is very much pressing forwards. He's looking to unsettle the centre-backs, push the ball out into the full-back area and try and get them to play that long pass, whereas Ings can do that. But he's also an absolute nightmare for midfielders, because he's constantly dropping off and he's pressing midfielders from effectively behind if they're facing towards our goal. And the number of times that, particularly Armstrong and Ings will kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They'll coalesce around a player and rob the ball off them in concert and then drive forwards. And Walcott, for all his ability, isn't as good at doing that, because I think there are very, very few strikers in the Premier League who are. And he just adds that extra bit of difficulty for teams trying to play out from the back. Because you've broken the first line of the press. You actually haven't, because Danny Ings is the first and second line of the press.
I mean, that's a really good way to describe it. And I think, when you're talking about Lamptey earlier being kind of back, it so often happens with Danny Ings as well. We've lost the ball up front, and then a passage of play happens, the camera pans back, and it's Danny Ings kind of stopping the attack or heading out from the box, and it's really impressive to see. We don't just miss him up front when he's gone. We miss him in midfield and we miss him in defence as well. And I bet you if you gave him a pair of gloves, he'd do a job in goal as well. He's that good at the moment. Walcott, I agree. He's done really well to step into Ings's shoes. I don't think he was ever going to be able to do everything that Ings does, but it was good to have him back on the left-hand side as a winger. I think he's more effective there. We did see Walcott put a fairly decent shot in just wide of the post, and that was very much a sort of like jumping up and oohing moment for me in front of the telly. Walcott, he's done really well, but he is frustrating me a tiny bit with the amount of shots he seems to be putting off target. I'd love to see him test the keeper with that. And then I think it was against Wolves where he had a brilliant chance which he really needs to get on target. That's kind of something that's happened all the way through his career, isn't it? That occasionally he gets in really good positions and just puts it wide or just off. He does almost everything right apart from the finishing bit.
Yeah, the question around Walcott, and this is why he throughout his career he's often said that he's a striker, but he is joint second for shots taken by volume for Southampton, with 15, joint with Danny Ings. Che Adams has had 20, and he's only put 4 of his shots on target, which is not great. And for someone with quite a high shot volume as well, that's the frustration thing. If you're taking not many shots, it's less of an issue if a proportion of them are off target, but he's actually taking more shots per 90 than any of our other players. So there is a sense that occasionally maybe he spurns an opportunity. But I think, his value, and this is one of the reasons why as a left winger he's good, is that he's a very assiduous presser. He's still very quick, and he adds that ability to arrive late, coming in a kind of an angled run, which maybe that doesn't generate a shot, but what it does do is it draws the opposition right back forwards, or it gives the opposition centre-back 2 players to worry about, or it pulls a midfielder back with him. And that sort of movement is, I think, he's a bit more dynamic on the left-hand side with that than Stuart Armstrong is on the right, although I'm a big fan of Stuart Armstrong. His talents are perhaps elsewhere. And for that reason, I think, Walcott is as much use as a decoy runner as he is as somebody who actually, has end product, because that can be frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things with Walcott, that end product has been frustrating, but I think we can all see that he's contributing a lot to the way Saints are playing. And what I think is also really quite interesting is I think from a transfer point of view, it came a bit from left field. It certainly doesn't fit the mould of a normal Ralph Hasenhüttl transfer, but then he's gone straight into the team, done a job in a couple of different positions, whereas I think Salisu was on the bench for the first time against Brighton, but we've still not seen him play. And Diallo's, he's been sparingly used. So it's interesting that he's been trusted in a way that the other players have, Ralph isn't quite ready to throw them in a big way that he has done with Walcott. So, there's a lot of good that Walcott's doing there. I'll kind of gloss over this point from the point where he lost the ball and then in attack, which gave Grace another chance, which was a fairly bad miss for Brighton. But I think if we're going to pick on a player for missing, Nathan Redmond wins this one. I mean, I was really pleased to see him coming onto the pitch. Good to have him back. He does score goals sometimes, but he also misses chances. And Danny Ings created a wonderful chance for Nathan Redmond, and how he didn't get this one on target, I don't know. Maybe it came too soon in coming back from injury, because it was only a couple of minutes after he was back on the pitch.
But it's kind of Nathan Redmond all over, isn't it? I feel sorry for Nathan Redmond, because it must be strange to have all of the skill, all the pace, everything in your locker, except the ability to consistently put the ball in the back of the net. And he almost seems to do worse with easier chances. I know it wasn't an easy chance. It was coming down, relatively close to the goal on the volley. He's only been on the pitch a few minutes. But it kind of summed up almost like everything about Nathan Redmond, didn't it? Being in the right place, right time, just not being able to finish it.
I mean, of all the Southampton players who've registered a shot on target this season, Nathan Redmond has the lowest accuracy rate, which, is kind of not unexpected, I suppose. And his first season with us, I think he scored 6 or 7. But since then, he frustrates. Like he clearly has a lot of talent. I think the application sometimes is in fits and starts. He seems like quite a confidence player, and he seems like a player who backs himself to do things some of the time, and sometimes they come off and they're brilliant. But when he's not backing himself, or when those things are going wrong, I think he can look a lot worse than he actually is all round.
He went to America, didn't he? And kind of got. Do you remember that period? A couple of seasons back, where he seemed to go to America when everyone else was on holiday in Dubai. He went to America, sorted his head out, sorted his fitness out, came back a world beater. Seemingly a world beater. I think then even got an England cap, and then just kind of since then he's scored some worldies. The guy against Crystal Palace, last season. But he kind of flatters to deceive, doesn't he? And you have to say, if Ings is back, and it would appear is clearly back, Walcott's going to play on the left, and Redmond's going to probably sit on the bench for a little while.
It's an interesting question about who's going to fill that role, whether it's going to be Redmond or Walcott. I don't know if either of you spotted this, but Southampton Twitter team put out a little quiz today, which was kind of which players of the top scorers since Ralph has been in charge. And I was quite surprised actually to see that Nathan Redmond has had 14 goals in the 2 years that Ralph has been in charge, which seems like quite a lot. And I can't remember him scoring 14 goals in the last 2 years, but I must be missing a purple patch from my memory. Obviously, Danny Ings and James Ward-Prowse are the ones ahead of him. Danny Ings with 34 since Ralph started, and James Ward-Prowse with 16, which is very impressive considering where he was pre-Ralph, I think.
Yeah, no, 14. Yeah, that's right. He got 3 in 2 games in the FA Cup, which may have bulked him up a little bit. And he got one in.
Is that against Derby?
I couldn't tell you, to be honest. But I mean, his kind of, it's interesting. If you go right back to when he was 20 and playing for Norwich, he was an assists guy. He was playing on the wing and banging crosses in. and it does kind of feel like, in a way that's perhaps not dissimilar to Walcott, that there are certain attributes in terms of his ability to run with the ball, his pace, his desire to shoot, that have him sort of caught halfway between being a wide player and being a forward, and so he gets himself into quite aggressive positions, which under Ralph's system is what the wide attacking players are supposed to do. But in some ways, he's better suited to being a provider than somebody who is regularly taking shots.
Yeah, I don't know if we will ever sort of figure it. It feels like he has that potential to be the guy who can do both. But I can exactly see what you're talking about there, Alex, in the way that he's assist guy trying to be converted into one of Ralph's kind of strangely named number 10s, where the wide player has to come in. I think Walcott has always wanted to do that. I think Thierry Henry was one of his heroes, and it's sort of that image that you want the left winger to be doing, and in Ralph's system you're kind of encouraged to do that, isn't it, to kind of turn inside and then actually create those sort of dangerous chances. Well, let's move on from Redmond's miss, because I think we've got a world-class long ball from Vestergaard from deep up to Kyle Walker-Peters, who charges into the box and gets fouled right from the edge of the box all the way through into the box, as VAR ruled. This seemed to be the particular main talking point for Sky on the coverage. I'm not sure if that was because generally the game was a little bit poor and devoid of chances, but they really, really focused on this. And I thought probably the most interesting thing was if this was one of those sort of clear-cut ones where the way they explain the rule works is that if the foul continues into the box, then it is a penalty. Then it was pretty clearly a penalty, in which case, why did it take so long? And why does everyone have to dwell on it all the time? I mean...
my initial... I said straight away, I thought it was a penalty. I straight away, I thought it was a penalty. And because I thought that... I think people were focusing on the initial challenge and saying, well, that's the foul. And it wasn't the foul. He has got away from Solly March. And I think he was through. And I was in two minds about, I still am very much in two minds about VAR, because you're like, well, you're right. If it takes that long, then it's not clear and obvious. But at the same time, should you then, put some sort of countdown, artificial, like timeline, like boom. If they haven't made a Stockley Parker decision within 60 seconds, they can't make a decision. It does seem to be strange, but I thought it was a pen straight away. I don't know. I thought it was, and I thought it was interesting. On BBC Radio Solent, they called it as a pen immediately.
Yeah, I mean that was my initial thought. Then I saw the replay, and I was like, "Oh, is it? Is it not?" But in some ways, I was kind of a little bit nervous about us getting a penalty instead of the free kick, because Saints aren't particularly great with penalties, but James Ward-Prowse is scintillating with the free kicks at the moment, and whether he's going to do a cross or a shot from there, I'd almost fancied that more than the penalty. But Ings puts it away. I thought it was a good penalty, really good that he's back in the goals already. Kudos for my brother, who decided to pick a semi-injured Ings for his fantasy team and get him back in there. So, serious faith in that. One of the things which I really enjoyed about both Vestergaard's goal and Ings's goal was with the fans back in the stadium, and there only been 2,000. I thought, I go to kind of a few non-league games here and there. It had a bit of a non-league sort of vibe with the sort of chants and the noise that was being created, which I really enjoyed. And also had that sort of non-league vibe of a distinct lack of away fans. So when the away team scores, there's just this like awful stony silence, which is then followed up with a few kind of swear words and inexplicable sort of comments from the home fans after that. And I really enjoyed that. And it was good to have the fans back and hear them silenced by both Vestergaard and Ings. I mean, what did you think about the fans being back? I mean, Alex, did you notice anything different with the 2,000 fans in the stadium or not?
I thought it was nice. I mean, obviously it's nice to have fans back and it's important for clubs' finances, but So I go and watch Winchester City quite regularly. And you're right, it had a non-league vibe. So because you didn't have the artificial crowd noise, which I just don't like, you heard enough of the crowd to know they were there, and also you could hear kind of distinct voices or distinct comments, which again is very non-league, but it wasn't drowning out the sound of the players. So you had that really good balance of being able to sometimes hear players communicating, but also that bit of atmosphere and humour, I suppose, which is important in football. So yeah, it was really nice to kind of have that mix. And when it goes back to just, I don't know, 40,000 people droning, I'm less keen on that.
Yeah, I wondered if I thought the atmosphere sounded particularly good, and I wondered if it's almost like, is it better to have 2,000 hardcore fans that are going nuts than 30,000, of which maybe 4,000 are only hardcore fans going nuts? And I thought they made a lot of noise, Brighton fans. I was impressed.
Yeah, I was quite impressed. I heard a Tottenham fan sort of describing it. So he was at the North London derby and one of only 2,000 fans in a massive Tottenham Hotspur stadium, and said it almost had the atmosphere of being the away fans. You know, that sort of semi-tribal feeling of a small group of you there for one reason and really enthusiastically supporting it. And Alex, to go back on your point on the humour, that is something that they just cannot get in with the kind of crowd noise DJ sound guy. How do you can't import football humour, which I think is a wonderful part of especially British non-league football and smaller crowds. Right, so I mean, let's move on from the Saints Brighton game. I mean, we held on for a sort of fairly underwhelming but important 3 points. I want to talk about how good Vestergaard is. I'm not even going to ask you who your man of the match is because it was so obvious. Vestergaard this season has been a revelation for me. I think Vestergaard has kicked on in a way that I didn't really realise was possible. And I remember seeing last season, like Leicester were rumoured to be wanting to get Vestergaard for over £20 million and just thinking, that is just madness. I mean, the Vestergaard experiment hasn't worked, but this season it's working really, really well. Where's this come from? It's really surprised me.
I mean, I'm a huge advocate of Ralph as a manager and as a tactician, but I think clearly there's also something going on with him and coaching and the coaching staff, because players are improving. I mean, even say Oriol Romeo, for example, has often been a good player, just seems to have that increased level of awareness now, mopping up, doing the bits and pieces. The team really seem to have gelled into the system, and some of that will be drilling the system, but some of that will be working on individual bits and pieces, which comes from the coaching team. And I think Vestergaard, I suppose technically one is surprised at his ability to pass, because he's big and he's physical and he's able to compete in the air. So, there's a kind of a lightness of touch there with his passing, which I think is really impressive. But also the way that he steps out of the defensive line, sometimes with the system that we use, it's quite easy for Southampton to become overwhelmed in central midfield, because generally you've only got 2 players in there. Even if it's a narrow 4-4-2, it's still a 4-4-2. And Vestergaard increasingly is the guy who steps out sensibly, doesn't do it all the time, but just is able to bring the ball forwards, and then straight away you're asking the opposition a question in terms of how their double pivot is set up. Are they going to go 2 for 2? Are they going to bring one towards Vestergaard? And it just opens up the opportunities for Southampton to progress the ball centrally. And I think he's been encouraged to do that quite clearly. And perhaps it's one of those instances where when a player has more responsibility given to them and is encouraged to do things that are in their game but that we didn't see before, it lifts everything about their performance, because they feel like they're much more... he didn't start the season. Jack Stevens started the season, didn't he? So, it's kind of come in and he's embraced this role and he's taken it on as he gets better and as he does what he's supposed to do well, it lifts his performance further.
He also doesn't seem to get caught out as much as he did in his appearances last season. I feel like on a few occasions last season, I was sort of looking at him despairingly, thinking, you're kind of so slow and out of position, or you haven't won that header. And I'm trying to work out, has he limited that from his game? Because I don't think he's necessarily become any quicker, which means I think he must have become more intelligent or more savvy in the way that he's positioning himself, that he's not having to draw on talents that he doesn't necessarily have in buckets, and he's able to focus on the things that he is doing well.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to assess why that's happened. I mean, it certainly has. It could be that McCarthy is increasing in confidence. I think McCarthy's having a really good season so far. One or two little errors aside, but I think that lifts the whole of the back line. And it does allow, the more the goalkeeper communicates and the more the back line is kind of fixed and solid and remains the same, which it has done for quite a few games now, those players are used to playing with one another. I think when Stevens came in for Bertrand, I can't remember which game it was, but Stevens had to play at left back. Newcastle game, that's right. That was an enforced change, but apart from that, he's basically kept the same backline where possible now, and as that unit gets more cohesive and the communication improves, positioning automatically gets better because there's a greater awareness of where your teammates are. Your teammates are less churlish about shouting at you to get into your position and hold it and that kind of, and that they seem to be growing as a unit together, which I think is possibly an explanation for that, because he won't have got faster. I mean, that doesn't happen at 28, really.
I wonder as well if just the fact, I wonder if it's we talk about strikers and confidence a lot, but maybe we don't really talk about defenders and confidence, and maybe Vestergaard just, now he's getting a long settled run in the team, in a team that's playing well, with players in front of him that he knows will happily do the disciplined work if it does go wrong, in Ward-Prowse and Romeo, to help him out and cover him. And he just seems to be, a man transformed. Like, everything he does, he seems to get right. And I wonder as well, last season we kind of had the prototype of this, didn't we, with Stevens, where Stevens was encouraged to run forward and pass the ball and try and create attacks. But I think that the difference for me seems to be, as Saints have changed and Saints have become less reliant on long balls over the top or long balls into the centre-backs to try and make them make mistakes so we can win the ball back, which was kind of what, Jack Stevens had a good run of assists last season for Danny Ings, didn't he? Sort of long balls from the back. Vestergaard's different. Maybe he seems to be much more comfortable with the ball on the ground, fizzing balls in at quite a rate of knots into midfielders and forwards. And I wonder if, as Saints have evolved their game away from the long ball, Vestergaard is the player that can, like a wrecking ball, just kind of stroll through the midfield and cause a bit of chaos, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we saw that a number of times against Brighton. His ability to bring the ball forwards is certainly a real asset. I think it's also worth saying that he's got Ryan Bertrand outside him consistently now. And for my money, Bertrand is the smartest player in the team. In terms of tactical understanding, in terms of positioning, Bertrand is often, he's pointing to where people should be going. He's very, very aware of where everybody is on the pitch, and he's not the captain. Obviously, he's not the captain, but he's the kind of brains trust of that team to a degree, I think, and obviously super experienced as well. And I wonder whether having that, with Romeo in front and Bertrand outside, Vestergaard's he's nicely cushioned by the players around him, so that when he does carry the ball forwards, it's with the awareness of everybody else, and he's well positioned to be able to do that with sufficient cover and with the players that know what he's going to be doing and can make sure that they're not then caught out of position if he loses the ball, for example, and that will give him confidence in what he's doing as well.
I've also been wondering if Romeo has helped that in quite a big way. So I think Romeo is doing a really fantastic job, and in that kind of position in midfield, and it feels a little bit crazy because I think Højbjerg is exactly what Tottenham needed and what they wanted, and he's having a really great season with Tottenham. But Saints have also been improved by Romeo and Ward-Prowse being in midfield, and I guess kind of maybe where Vestergaard differs from Jack Stevens, I think Jack Stevens had the ability to roam forward, take on players and then play the long ball. Vestergaard also seems to be able to play that quick, shorter pass into Romeo and spot the opportunities where moving through the centre of midfield quickly is the right option, or like he did with Kyle Walker-Peters winning the penalty, whether it's the long ball over the top. And that element seems to have both, and seems to be able to do both of them quite calmly. And you're probably right. I mean, having Bertrand and Romeo there from that point of view is good, but also Romeo from an attacking point of view, which is something I just never thought I'd hear myself saying.
Well, he's a good wall pass option, isn't he, Romeo? Because he's so physically strong. And he's not the kind of player who's going to take it and turn and stride off up the pitch, because he just isn't. But in terms of his ability to take the ball under pressure and then play it back and just give the centre-back that little bit of extra time to move slightly into position or open up a passing angle, I think he's really, really key to that. So, yeah, no, I'd say that's correct.
Cool. Right, let's move on. So, Saints are now up to 5th in the Premier League table, breaking the top 6 reunion party, which they were having on Sunday, the top 6 Big Six. So we're up to 5th. We've also gone past the 2-year anniversary of Ralph being our manager, and I mean, it feels very, very different, this Saints team, from the one that Ralph took over 2 years ago, where it just looked like Mark Hughes was destined to get us relegated. But we're also, the first year under Ralph wasn't always plain sailing, and this time last year I think we were in the relegation zone again, which I don't think any of us necessarily expected. Obviously we know that he managed to turn it around in the end, but at this sort of 2-year anniversary of Ralph, Alex, I know that you love the tactics side of things, so Have the 2 years of Ralph been everything you've expected and more, or what's your kind of moment of reflection here?
So my first is slightly smug, because I'm on record about 2 months before we appointed him saying that he was the guy we should go and get, and that was partly because Tifo used to do some work with the Bundesliga, so I always had an interest in German football and had seen this guy playing, you know, a really exciting pressing style of football. I liked the way Leipzig set up, and he was at that point out of work, and it seemed like such a good fit for somebody to come in and begin to institute a style of play that was quite different to a lot of what was happening in the Premier League, but was obviously, you know, had the potential to be successful because that kind of pressing style was working well for people like Jurgen Klopp. I think it took him time to bed in. You know, the squad that he inherited had quite a lot of missteps in it. And he clearly has been working towards creating a squad that's more in the image of what he wants. And I think you're right. It's interesting that players like Walcott are part of that, because you can't say that that's, or rather, if that were a transfer that were foisted on him by the ownership, he seems to have embraced it wholeheartedly. So, you know, it seems unlikely that it was that. But people like Kyle Walker-Peters, you know, having done so well on loan, then becoming a full member of the team. Diallo, I think, is a really promising player. He was always going to be a manager that needed time. You know, managers like Ralph and like Jurgen Klopp can't come in and change the tone and the style of a team overnight, because pressing, and particularly this kind of pressing, is too complicated for that. And I think the ownership of the club deserve great credit for, you know, unreservedly backing him, even in those periods where it looked like things were not going well, because that will have, you know, given him such a degree of confidence in his ability to shape the squad, and he will have known, because he's this kind of person, he will have known where he was going to be in a year or 2 years' time with, if he could build a squad in the right sort of way, the style of football he wanted to play. And the board just went, yeah, get on with it. And I think we're seeing the benefits of that now.
And do you think the board have given him everything that he's wanted? Because it's interesting that he seems to have done more with improving the players in and around the squad that were here when he arrived, than him kind of going out and cherry picking players from the Bundesliga, which I sort of expected to happen when he came in. And we've seen he's kind of quite slow to bleed a player into the squad, but yet he also seems to be very happy with the sort of higher level of control that I think he has over most other managers in the Premier League. But is there more that we can do to get more out of Ralph?
I mean, I think every manager wants more money to spend, don't they? But I do think that, Salisu, for example, he's not a player a huge amount about, but I know people who follow La Liga regularly were very, very hot on him when he was there. Diallo, fits the profile, young, energetic, fits into that, withdrawn central midfield role really nicely. So if you gave him more money, he would probably find slightly better players of that type. But like I said, before, in terms of trying to recruit players for Southampton, it is tricky because you're recruiting players for such a set system that requires very specific things, not just in terms of footballing technique, but also in terms of work ethic, willingness, the ability to learn. That's why I think players like Bertrand are so important, because he just has this breadth of tactical knowledge and experience that means he understands what's being asked of him, but he can also guide other players in that. So I don't think if you gave Ralph Hasenhüttl £1 million, £100 million, he would go out and splurge it all on big name players, because I just don't see that they would fit the ethos and fit the style that well. Aside from that, I mean, you're right. He's developed players who are already there. And that's clearly a talent that he has, and some of those younger players coming through I think are interesting. People like Smallbone, that he seems to have a lot of confidence in. Even if he's not playing that much, he's saying all of the right things. But it's very much an upward trajectory. For me, the question is how long we can hold on to him for.
I mean, that's
Don't say that.
Yeah, but you got to be realistic, haven't you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think to your point about improving players. If you look at, Romeo last night was immense, and the amount of times when, Brighton were pressing really hard, and Romeo just managed to just get out of trouble, didn't he? And just get the ball away to one of the centre backs who can then ping it onto a full back. And you think, how much would it? To your point about £100 million, how much would it cost to buy a Romeo? How much would it cost to buy a James Ward-Prowse? Probably cost you £30-40 million to buy a player of James Ward-Prowse's calibre. And they were kind of players that were languishing before Ralph, but weren't really doing much. And I think that's the most impressive thing about him is his willingness to work with what he's got, and to improve rather than just to kind of try and buy players.
Yeah, some of those players are doing stuff that I didn't really necessarily know that they were capable of, which is just really, really great to see from Ralph. So I think at 2 years, we're fifth in the league. What is a realistic target for us? We had Carl Anker on last week, and he was far too sensible. I think he predicted us for ninth. Alex, I want you to get more excited than ninth. Like, where are we going to end up with Ralph? And, where do you think we'll end up this season? But I suppose more importantly, if we are able to continue to have Ralph at the helm, what's the sort of the ceiling of his potential achievement as a Southampton manager? And, sort of following the similar sort of trajectory. So we're not imagining that we have got a new owner that is going to furnish him with 100 million. We're sort of thinking similar sort of transfer policy?
It's a very, very hard question to answer. I mean, look. So in terms of say underlying numbers, Southampton's position in the table is perhaps slightly flattering if you look at XG, albeit on a smallish sample size. But then I would argue that Southampton are a really weird case when it comes to that sort of metric, because we're scoring goals from headers, we're scoring goals from free kicks, but like the reason we're outperforming our XG is because of the kind of goals that we're actively setting out to score. We're also really good, you know, in terms of trying to get ahead early, and game state alters those things. So the reason I say all of that is because one of the easy ways to look at where a team's going to finish up ultimately is that sort of metric. But I think Southampton are such an odd case that it's quite hard to be able to infer anything from that.
And it's a really interesting point, Alex, because the XG tables, we used to break them the wrong way around by creating loads of chances and not scoring the goals.
Yeah, we were consistently amazing at chance creation and consistently appalling at chance conversion.
And now we flip that on its head. So how's that happened?
Well, I think it's partly playing to the strengths of, you know, if you've got James Ward-Prowse, who's the best set piece taker in the league, and you've got a 6'6" centre half who's really, really good at scoring headers, you know, obviously that's something you're going to look to play for. I think also because Southampton have they have this thing of attacking the box in kind of two waves, and that quite often creates opportunities where, you know, Ings is firing through two or three players, because he's on the sort of the second go of that. So I think if you looked at our goals, you would see a lot of quite low XG opportunities, but as a result of a deliberate tactic rather than trying to hoon it in from 30 yards. So I don't, you know, there are teams that do, or I mean, Lucien Favre, for example, at Borussia Dortmund, is famed for kind of breaking XG models because his teams always exceed XG by quite a significant portion. It may be that because of the way Southampton play, there is a certain kind of magic happening there, and XG, you know, it's great at the end of the season. You can look at certain sorts of things and there is a correlation, but it may still be too early to look at that stuff now with any real degree of confidence. And in fact, you know, the only reason I bring it up is to try and have a stab at answering where they end up. I still predicted at the beginning of the season something like 10th or 11th. I can't remember. And it wouldn't surprise me if we settled to there. But I also think that the middle of the table is now as competitive as I can remember it being. You know, you've got teams like Everton in 9th with all of the qualities that they have. You've got teams like Brighton who are massively underperforming in 16th. It's just very, very difficult to work out where anybody's going to fall out. And then you add on top of that the fact that it is this weirdly condensed season, where bigger teams, you know, sometimes are playing 3 fixtures in a week, and there's all this stuff about, you know, the Saturday 12:30 kickoffs and stuff. So it's incredibly, it's even harder to predict than normal what's happening. And that, you know, that's the kind of situation in which a team like Southampton could thrive, and end up finishing in the top 6. I would expect us to regress a little bit. But who knows?
I suppose that the regression may well come in the next, if we say next 6 fixtures. So taking us up to the day after New Year's Day, we've got Sheffield United, who've been woeful this season. We've got Arsenal, who, although they've not been great, they are still Arsenal. We've also got Man City and Liverpool in that run, and then West Ham, who are performing pretty well, the other fixture being Fulham. So, I mean, there's some interesting fixtures taking us into the new year there. I guess as a sort of gauge, of where you think we are? I mean, and Tom and Alex, I both want you to answer this. What do you, when you're looking at those next 6 fixtures, what are you feeling? Do you think are we going to see 6 points, 9 points, 12 points? What are we going to be looking at from those 6 fixtures?
Well, I think it's interesting. I thought the game last night was really important, and I thought it was really important to put the Man United game to bed just quickly and just move on from that. So looking at the games, I mean, Sheffield United are a funny one because arguably they're probably, this is a silly thing to say, they're probably not as bad a team as they are currently being. They conceded a lot of goals at the start of the season. They're now not conceding that many. They're just losing lots of games 1-0. And Saints obviously do have a long and storied tradition of giving teams who are no-hopers something, or giving players who don't score, like Rhian Brewster, the opportunity to get their first goal. So who knows? But you would think that, I mean, they're not going to fear anyone, first and foremost. And I don't think it's unrealistic to think they'll go to Arsenal and get something. If we look there, our next 5 games: Sheffield United, Arsenal, Man City, Fulham, West Ham. If you look at those 5 games, I wouldn't be surprised if you see Saints take 9 points.
So we're assuming that out of those 6 games, with Liverpool being the 6th, that's still 9 points then, Tom?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think can they get a result out of really misfiring Arsenal that are out of sorts? Absolutely. Can they beat Man City? They did it last year. Then you've got Fulham, West Ham. That's a really difficult game, but I don't see why they'll fear anyone, to be honest. And to be honest, they'll want to play these teams now when they're playing well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd say the hardest games of that lot are West Ham and Liverpool, which might sound weird given that Manchester City and Arsenal are in it. But I mean, Arsenal are just bereft of shot opportunities at the moment, so I don't see much from them. Man City, you can get at them. They are not the team that they were even last season. I know they're off the back of a very strong result, but there's something about the porousness of that central midfield that I can see us exploiting. And I'm still not a massive fan of their centre-backs. So I think there's... Fulham, I think, are a bit tricky. I think Anguissa is not a dissimilar player to Bissouma and can, on his day, again, the sort of guy who would probably fit very well at Southampton. Good presser, good ball carrier. So I wouldn't say that that's, an easy 3 points. From that lot, I'd say 10 maybe points, maybe 12 if we're really lucky.
That's the sort of optimism I'm liking, the 12-point sort of region. I mean, also, do you think we're going to see the tonic that is lemonade against Fulham? I mean, I suppose that's a big question on everyone's lips at Southampton.
He can't play, can he?
Is he on loan, is he?
He's on loan, yeah.
Okay. Right, well, look, we've been talking for quite a long time now. I've kind of lost track of time because I've been enjoying the conversation so much. I had 2 kind of lovely emails from our American listeners, but I'm afraid that we don't have time to read them on this one. Tom and Alex, before we draw things to a close, is there anything that you've just bursting to get out there?
Not especially. I'm not really a bursting kind of person, as anyone who regularly listens to Tifo will tell you.
Is there anything that you want to kind of quietly and calmly present, Alex, before we close the channels of recordings?
Just look at Tifo videos and listen to Tifo podcasts, and have a really good Christmas.
I'll
second that. Tom?
Yeah, nothing from me. Just I think a great win last night. I'm really excited about Saints. Isn't it great to be really excited and really believe in it and have a manager that's bringing us all on a journey? I think it's fantastic.
It's a good time. We've got a good thing going on at the moment. Listeners, as you know, you can find us on Twitter at SaintsFC Podcast, and do email in saintsfcpodcast@gmail.com. I promise to read some emails out next time we're recording, so do get them in if you want. If there's anything that you want me and Tom to discuss, or any of our guests to discuss. Alex, it's been an absolute joy to have you on the podcast, and it's been a joy to sort of follow the works of Tifo over the last few years, and it's also quite nice now that Southampton are tactically interesting enough that you seem to be covering them a little bit more in Tifo. It always gives me a little smile when I'm listening to your podcast and you manage to crowbar some Southampton stuff in there, so keep on doing that. It brings me much joy, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to say goodbye to the listeners. Tom and Alex, you're welcome to do the same.
Goodbye.
And I've realised I'm just pressing the wrong phaser here for this crowd noise, so here it comes.